For this month's Culture Awareness presentation, I'll be focusing on a report conducted by the Assembly of First Nations. The Assembly of First Nations, formerly known as the National Indian Brotherhood, is a body of First Nations leaders in Canada. The goals of the organization are to protect the rights, treaty obligation, ceremonies, and claims of First Nations in Canada. Currently, the Assembly of First Nations chief is Sean Atlow. The organization established themselves in 1968 during a time when Indian activism was taking rise. In the past, the organization has focused on issues such as education, self-governance, and First Nation child welfare. The report that I'm going to be focusing on for this presentation is Understanding the Overrepresentation of First Nations Children in the Child Welfare System. The report was released in 2011 and it was co-authored by 18 writers. The writers were representatives from across the nations. Some universities and organizations that were represented were McGill University, University of Regina, University of Calgary, University of Toronto, First People Child and Family Review Journal, Native Child and Family Services. The Canadian Incident Study is the only national study in Canada to provide data on the investigations that child welfare agencies conduct into reports on child maltreatment-related concerns involving First Nations children. One key theme that stands out to me in the report is the overrepresentation of First Nations children in the child welfare system is primarily driven by cases of neglect, rather than other forms of maltreatment, such as physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional maltreatment, or exposure to intimate partner violence. When they discuss neglect, they focus on three elements: poverty, poor housing, and caregiver substance abuse. The data for this report were taken from investigations which were open between October 1st and December 31st, 2008. They looked at a total of 15,346 investigations. The investigations were conducted by 89 provincial territorial agencies and 22 of the First Nations and urban Aboriginal children and family services agencies, which were mandated to conduct child welfare investigations in Canada. Due to the time allotted for this presentation, I will be focusing on three topics. What is child maltreatment? A brief history of the First Nations child welfare system, and the current structure of First Nations child welfare. Research since the 1980s has increasingly embraced a perspective in which child maltreatment occurs when multiple individual, family, community, and societal level risk factors outweigh protective factors. While a large body of research demonstrates that child maltreatment can have very severe negative effects on physical health, mental health, behavior, social relationships, academic achievement, and outcomes in other domains, it also shows that long-term impacts of maltreatment vary according to factors which include child age, type, duration, severity of abuse, relationship to abuser, individual characteristics, family access to social support, community well-being, and child social environment. Modern approaches to understanding maltreatment also explicitly acknowledge the impact of history on caregiver-child interaction. They note that caregivers' actions may be influenced by both personal history through intergenerational transmission of specific parenting behaviors, strategies, and by larger historical changes, which may include colonial impacts on culturally based child rearing practices and on social, economic, and political systems in which caregivers are embedded. Since personal history and historical change plays an important role in understanding maltreatment, let's take a closer look at the history of the First Nations child welfare system. Across the provinces and territories in Canada's child welfare system, Aboriginal children are greatly overrepresented in out-of-home care. The rate of Aboriginal out-of-home placement is 14.6 times the rate of non-Aboriginal placements in Alberta. As indicated in Table 101, the proportion of children in care who are Aboriginal is greater than the Aboriginal proportion of the child population in all provinces for which data was available. If you look, out of the 7 provinces, 4 of them have Aboriginal youth in care that reaches over 50%. This is unacceptable. The current overrepresentation of First Nations children in out-of-home care extends and a historical pattern of removal of First Nations children from their homes which is grounded in colonial history, and accordingly, the current overrepresentation cannot be understood without a basic understanding of the history of First Nations child welfare. Prior to colonizations, First Nations families and communities cared for their children in accordance with their cultural practices, spiritual beliefs, laws, and traditions. Extended families and communities played a major role in raising the child. Stories were used to help teach values and behaviors by example, and elders were available to parents needing advice or prayer. One story that comes to mind, an elder shared with me, when he was a young man, he was sitting with a grandmother, and she was asking him, "What is the most important ceremony of life?" The elder, who had grown up around ceremony his whole life, began reciting different ceremonies. The sun dance, the sweat lodge, bundle opening, and he continued on for a bit, until finally the grandmother stopped him and said, "Grandson, these are all very important ceremonies, but the most important ceremony of all is the birth of the child." Then after a long pause, she looked at him and she said, "And who does that make you?" So the moral of the story is that we're all sacred beings, and our children need to be loved and respected. This is very different from the Eurocentric ideology that children were property and they were not to be spoiled. Children could not be seen or heard. This creates an attitude of dominance over children. So with the arrival of the settlers and introduction of the residential school systems, First Nations lifestyles and their relationship to their children was forever changed. I would now like to take some time and focus on the effects of the residential school system. The residential school system was initially responsible for provision of child welfare services to First Nations communities in Canada. The residential school system interrupted traditional way of life, and the motto was to kill the Indian and save the child. Children as young as 5 were taken from their families and communities and placed in residential schools, sometimes hundreds of miles from their community. The schools were run by churches such as the Anglican, Catholic, Presbyterian, and United Churches, and the funding came from the Canadian government. During the residential school era, there was a total of 132 schools throughout Canada, and over 150,000 First Nations young people went through the system. Duncan Campbell Scott estimated that 50% of children who attended residential schools died of disease and neglect. Here is a detailed list of other abuses the young people faced while in school. So not only were the children facing horrific abuses, but can you just imagine a community without children from the ages of 5 to 18? Though some students have spoken of the positive experiences of residential school and of receiving an adequate education, the quality of education was low in comparison to non-Aboriginal schools. In 1930, for instance, only 3 of 100 Aboriginal students managed to advance past grade 6, and few found themselves prepared for life after school, on the reservation and off. In 2006, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was developed. The purpose of the commission was to provide healing program initiatives for communities and victims affected by the residential school, as well as fight for individual funding for victims. The following story was shared by a residential school survivor at a Truth and Reconciliation workshop on Friday, October 14, 2011. I was an ordinary child, he said. I went to school in Eskasoni for a while. I didn't understand anything about the English language at the time. Mostly we were speaking Mi'kmaq. When my father was alive, he taught us in Mi'kmaq. He chopped wood, we would get water, we would make sure everything would be okay for the next day, so we wouldn't be hungry or cold for the winter. As a young boy, I didn't understand why they took me away from my homeland and from my parents. I now know that we didn't do anything wrong because we were innocent, he said. We stopped at almost every train station. We saw a lot of Native children standing on the side of the platform. There were no families, no relatives, no uncles, grandfathers, nobody to say goodbye to them. No hugs. There were a lot of children crying. Upon arrival at the school, the children were met by nuns and priests who ran it. The boys and girls were separated. They had their clothes taken away and their heads shaved. They scrubbed us so hard trying to take the Indian away from us, he said. They said, you have no parents to come and help you. You have no grandparents to help you. He said he recalls in later years, little boys crying as they approached the big red school, and as the older boy, he knew there were no way to help them. Once we got locked up behind those closed doors, no turning back. No turning back at all. You can't run away because they'll always bring you back, he said. The children were not allowed to speak the Mi'kmaq language. Any violations of the rules were punished harshly. If you said a wrong word, you were going to get hit on the head. Boom. Say your prayers right. Kneel down right, he said. We'd get hit on the head when we were saying the rosary at night. After an hour, our kneecaps would get sore. One rule is that children were not allowed to go to the bathroom after 10 p.m. Lafford said he became a bedwetter as a result and was forced to carry his soiled bedclothes on his head through the cafeteria at breakfast time every time it happened. They strapped us almost every night. He said, bend down and touch your toes, take your pants off. He described it just like being in a cell. Punishments also included being locked in cupboards. He described being slapped for speaking Mi'kmaq. His mother died while he was at school, and he remembered being yelled at for crying in his bed after he found out. Life went by, days went by, years went by, he said. I hope to Creator that things like this will never happen to anyone else. It was hard to let go of things that you loved. It's not easy to be a child and to grow up in a different world. It's not easy to walk with your head up when your head is down. Lafford attended the residential school until it closed in 1967. He finished his schooling in Toronto and considered staying there, but decided to return to Cape Breton. I went back to my community where I belong, where I can speak my language, to be with my family, my uncles, my aunties, my cousins, my friends, he said. That's where I wanted to be. His experience at residential school continued to affect him. He said he drank and used drugs when he got older, often ending up in jail. He had difficulty with jobs and relationships. He said he thought about suicide at times, but then everything changed. I became a dancer, he said, a traditional dancer. I loved the powwow music. I liked the sound of the drum. I liked the sound of the people singing. My life changed. I respect myself, I honor myself, and I love myself for who I am today.